What's up everyone? Alex here. One of the most elusive styles of JRPGs has to be the one that you can play with your friends. Now I'm not talking about the ones where you pass the controller to your friend just so that they can play it. I'm talking about one where either you or the four of you can share your adventures together at the same time and experience things that no other JRPG delivers. After 8 years in development, Granblue Fantasy Relink has finally arrived with a potential answer. But with such a prolonged development cycle, it does make you wonder. Does Granblue Fantasy Relink reach the highest of highs while steering clear of the lowest of lows? Granblue Fantasy Relink is an action RPG with co-op elements, set in an entirely original Granblue Fantasy story created by Cygames Osaka and published by Cygames, who provided me with this PS5 review code. As either Gran or Jita, your team of Skyfarers are on a journey to discover a mysterious island known as Lucia that can make your wishes come true. And along the way, you'll encounter nefarious foes vying for control over this potentially powerful place. When the demo for the game came out, Granblue Fantasy Relink invited many comparisons with games like Tales of Arise and even Xenoblade Chronicles. But in truth, the closest comparison it's got with any game has to be with the Monster Hunter series. That said, there are some noteworthy differences. For starters, Relink's combat animations aren't as rigid as Monster Hunter's. Unlike the aforementioned game, it's actually quite easy to string a ton of fluid combos. And for button mashers out there, you'd also be happy to know that guarding and dodging, among many other features, also cancels animations. This basically means that animation locking, which is something that often causes players to be open to attacks in Monster Hunter, isn't really a common occurrence here. Though I should note that dodging 3 times in a short span of time will have you go into a recovery animation that you cannot cancel, and guarding too many attacks will leave you open to an attack once it breaks. This is all to say that for the most part, you can play Granblue Fantasy Relink much like any other action RPG out there, and not have to worry about your attacks, leaving you open to enemy retaliation. A few people have compared Relink to both Tales of Arise and the Xenoblade series because of the enemy's HP pool, particularly because they don't drop like flies after a few hits. Given that Relink's combat system revolves around stringing combos and using bombastic team attacks to take down huge opponents, it would be counterintuitive, not to mention unsatisfying, to design its enemies to just fall flat after a hit or two. But that's not the only reason why enemy HP pools are big, as bosses often have multiple phases that not only make them almost impervious to damage, but also alter their attack patterns in such a way that you'll have to adapt to an escalating battle that's very different from what you started with. And when you consider the notion that Relink's boss battles feel like they're heavily inspired by similar fights in MMOs and live service games, the mechanics and phases that you experience throughout start to make a lot of sense. In Monster Hunter, the weapon you choose determines how you play the game, as each has different mechanics unique to them. In Granblue Fantasy Relink, every single character has a unique gimmick that differentiates themselves from others. What this means is that unlike the former, Relink can introduce brand new characters in future updates that play dramatically different from those already packed in the game, adding a reason or two to come back to the game later down the line. On top of that, there's also a mastery tree that allows you to unlock new abilities and features, like perfect guarding and dodging, that are simply a must-have. And as you might expect, every character's mastery tree is different. And much like Monster Hunter, Relink features a gear grind, though it's actually quite easy to understand what's needed, requiring players to take on multiple quests in order to acquire the necessary materials they need. And it's in these quests that invite yet another comparison with Monster Hunter. By signing up for a quest at the quest counter in town, you're able to party up with up to a total of 4 players to take on challenges together. What's more is that you can also take on any quest even if you haven't unlocked it in your game, though you won't be able to get credit for its completion until you encounter it in your own story progression. This solves a big problem that I have with Monster Hunter, as the games awkwardly require you to keep at pace with your friend's story progression in order to continue playing with them. In Relink, not only is this requirement dropped, but there are also options that'll let you skip cutscene spoilers altogether to help retain the mystery of the story. Which does remind me, prior to its release, Granblue Fantasy Relink's developers claimed that its main story would take between 20 to 25 hours to finish. In reality, it's been confirmed by many players that the main story actually takes between 10 to 15 hours to finish, with my playthrough reaching the 10-hour mark by the time I reached the post-game. And speaking of the quality of its story, I do want to be upfront and say that I've personally never been a fan of Granblue Fantasy's brand of storytelling, whether through the original mobile game, the fighting game, or the anime. To be clear, it's not that I think the story is bad, far from it in fact, but the way Granblue Fantasy tells its narrative is a little too straightforward for my tastes, to the point that you can pretty much sum up the actual plot of the game in 3 words. And because its narrative style doesn't allow for the type of Asian melodrama that lets its characters blossom forth and reveal their motivations to you, any important character development and backstory is tucked away in numerous Fate episodes that feature tons of lengthy text overlaid on top of a static background. What's more is that any characters you unlock and play as while going through the story don't really get any significant screen time, as the narrative was designed to prominently feature the original Skyfarer team that you started with. But I'd like to offer an alternate take to my critiques. Because its narrative is a lot more straightforward than most other JRPGs, Granblue Fantasy Relink can focus its efforts on delivering the parts of itself that it excels at, namely its presentation, gameplay, and the ability to bring players together. As you can imagine, it's extremely difficult to find games that are casual enough but have enough depth that players of all kinds can just dive in and immerse themselves in its gameplay. And Granblue Fantasy Relink actually does all of that spectacularly. Because you've got simple characters to learn the basics with in both Gran and Jita, your initial experience with the game will give you the confidence to further explore the roster to find a playstyle that perfectly suits you. And you're even given agency to choose which characters you'd like to unlock during your story progression, as hitting specific story beats will grant you crewmate cards that'll let you unlock characters in any order you want. But perhaps the most surprising thing about Granblue Fantasy Relink, one that no comparison with any other game will reveal, is how incredibly set-piece heavy this game is. While the demo did feature a massive explorable landmass, this doesn't really showcase some of the incredible dungeons and challenges that Relink will put you through. One chapter has you taking on a mighty dragon while airborne aboard your ship, while another has you quickly running through massive headwinds that are tearing apart the platforms beneath you. This is, once again, where Relink's dungeon designs parallels many other MMOs and live service games, combined with huge set pieces that's typically only found in higher budget action games. Combining these elements with its action combat gives Relink a unique identity of its own, effectively carving out its own niche amongst the many Monster Hunter-likes out there and giving us an adventure that's truly unlike any other. Yet while reports of the main story's length can dissuade others from getting the game, what's not being talked about enough is the hundreds of quests that await you in the post-game. New upgrade mechanics get unlocked upon reaching the post-game, as well as brand new quests and new challenges, which can lead to even more hours of playtime, especially when you're taking these on with other players online. There's even the promise of new quests and characters being added in free updates later on, with brand new boss battles that mimic the difficult fights found in the original. And to finally put an end to all the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, Granblue Fantasy Relink features zero gacha mechanics whatsoever. And when you consider the way Granblue Fantasy's world is presented, brightly colored, painterly in places, and teeming with movement and life, you'll start to understand why the series has so many fans. Granblue Fantasy has never been about delivering some deep narrative storytelling with tons of twists and turns. Rather, it's a relatively wholesome tale that's got clear delineations between good and evil, that wants to immerse you in a world where capturing the feeling of adventure is paramount, framed by some gorgeous UI designs that evoke the essence of exploring an uncharted world hidden in the skies above. While it's easy to say that its shorter main story length can be a detriment, Its ability to present a no-frills narrative devoid of fluff and padding is something that should be celebrated. And combining that with incredible dungeon designs, fun character mechanics that'll have you exploring the entire roster, and a presentation that exudes its high production value, and you wouldn't think that this game was in development hell for almost a decade. Granblue Fantasy Relink is an adventure that is absolutely worth taking on either by yourself or with new and old friends online. And it's the co-op game we JRPG fans have dreamed of playing for years, and hopefully for even more years to come.